Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on when you're watching this. My name is Gregory Bufidis, and I'm the founder and CEO of Illuminative Media. This is a new operation for us. We're going to inaugurate our brand new studios. And as you can see, my staff has locked me up into a room here, a soundproof room almost. A series of interviews with who are people that I think are expertise in certain areas. And Andy, who I'm going to get to in a minute, is certainly one of them. Today's chat is really going to be about Israel and some related matters, obviously about the Hamas attacks over the weekend. And it's interesting because Andy is one of those guys who's really a pain to interview with because he backs up everything he's saying with exhibits, information, etc. But obviously, in the last week or so, we have been inundated with all types of information, good and bad, coming out of Israel. We know how the attacks, we think anyway, we know how the attacks were executed, how cyber defenses and other normal military defenses were breached. We know that at one point a heavily fortified and backed up Gaza Strip for some reason was left almost vacant by Israeli troops because they had been moved to the West Bank. And to give you an idea of what I'm talking about is you'll see now some maps of Israel to give you an idea of the area we're talking about, where the Gaza Strip is, where the West Bank is, and how troops were moved, to give you a little bit of orientation. And please pardon me as I look down because I've got tons of notes. I've been up almost all the night, almost the entire night, talking to my military intelligence community as well as my contacts in Israel to get all this information straight. And that obviously informs the chat I'm going to have with Andy in a few moments. There's a lot of questions in Israel about why the warnings given were not observed, the fact that the Israeli Defense Ministry had at one point realized that a breach was undertaken, and yet there was no response by Israeli troops or intelligence community in Israel. And if you go on to almost any social media stream, you'll find out that the government is being held to blame for a lot of that. We're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about more the cybersecurity issues as well as the kinetic war issues and how all of that stuff has kind of been wrapped up. So without any further ado, let me go into a little background on Andy to give you some idea of the expert you're going to talk to. Andy and I have known each other for years, and he is kind of a go-to guy when anything props up as far as cybersecurity. And if you follow him on LinkedIn, you realize that he very often knows way ahead of mainstream media, most of us, what's going on and what's going on behind the headlines. Andy has his own cybersecurity company. I think for most of my readers and most of the people that watch my videos, you know Andy very, very well because he was at the cusp of understanding the SolarWinds cyber breach that was executed by the Russians back in 2020. In fact, if you pardon me if I'm reading, it was Andy's research paper and his analysis that was presented to the United States Senate Intelligence Committee back in January 2021 when they were giving this examination. Andy has written tons of articles. He's written numerous books, and I'm going to summarize those at the end with some graphics so you can see those books at the end of this interview. He has been quoted in too many articles and too many sources, and I was going through his CV last night. He actually even appeared in an interview with the Vatican News Agency, which was new to me. Anyway, you get the picture. Andy and I have been chatting on, I would say, an almost bi-weekly basis since the Ukraine war, but in the last week, I think we've chatted 4 or 5 times each day about these issues, because very often something pops up that even given my background, I don't understand or I don't follow. So Andy is kind enough to stop what he's doing momentarily and just give me some background to make me understand what it is I'm looking at. Andy, it's nice to see you. Nice to have you back. I am here in our new studios. You are back there in Windsor, England, which I believe is the home of Windsor Castle, but I'm assuming that you're not in Windsor Castle. Or are you in Windsor Castle? I wasn't sure how the royal families, opened up themselves to allowing, commoners in or whatever.
Absolutely.
There's a couple of things I want to talk about at the very, very beginning before we get into the nuts of this, and that's the fact, something we've talked about a lot. Very often, we get sucked into a headline, and we don't realize what's going on behind the headline. And one example I want to bring is this past January, the FAA in the United States had what was called in the Main Street media a software fault, a glitch, and that it caused the entire U.S. domestic flight system to be shut down. And when questioned about it, we were told again and again and again, no, it's just a software glitch. If I recall, you were actually involved in this, and not in shutting down the domestic airline system, but you were actually involved. And I was wondering if you could just give us a little background to give us an idea of how the headline is not exactly accurate.
Sure. Gregory, it's a pleasure to be back with you. And obviously, we've spoken many times this week and over the last year. The FAA situation was really interesting because obviously we're based in the UK, so we're several hours ahead of the American time zone. And through our own alert system, we were made aware of the FAA's decision to ground the entire US airspace. The implications of that aren't just about domestic flights. They're also for military implications too, because the reality is, although a corrupt file, as you correctly say, was the narrative given out to the mainstream press, in reality, we discovered that the NOTAM's servers had actually been what we call command and control was no longer.
Explain those servers.
Those servers, basically, they allow, the NOTAM servers allow all information sharing to and from the FAA to every single pilot.
Okay.
That's flying across the US airspace, and the same is for every country across the world. Those servers tell you if it's safe, if you need to land, or if there's a, like the Icelandic, volcano ash cloud. It tells these guys what they can and can't do. And what had happened is the digital certificate, and we can go into as much information as you want, it's like a digital passport, that had been allowed to lapse. The servers were not secure, and the only way the FAA could actually be assured of not potentially allowing a digital 9/11 was to shut down the airspace. Mm-hmm. We helped them, and obviously, as I say, I was up at 6:30 that morning and going through the stuff that we do, and by 11:30 they'd come online and they were actioning the information we provided to them. By the end of the day, a narrative quite different than the one that we were reading about. Okay, incredibly different. And if people read between the lines, Gregory, I think the total costs are estimated about $8 billion for the day. So it's not insurmountable. But more importantly, the test, and I'll use that term, the test that was being given to the FAA and the entire United States of America is, if their airspace is closed, could they launch their own F-35 and military air force in an unsafe airspace? Think about the implications of that in a defense capability.
We had this conversation, and I was basically reaching for my bottle of wine.
Yeah.
All right. So, again, you read the headline, and there's always something else going on behind it. So let's get into Israel. Let's get into the U.S. and etc. And I want you to start this conversation, in effect, by setting the table. And something we talked about last night was that what we're talking about here is a combination of both what you and I have called digital espionage, surveillance systems that have failed miserably. It's basically what you would say a failure of basic security 101.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I think let me start at the beginning because it's a great place. People don't quite realize that websites backed up with servers and then backed up with what's known as DNS, domain name systems, that's the digital footprint. We call them internet assets. Imagine if digital assets like websites, servers, and domain name systems were shops. How many of 1,000 shops would you want to lock up each day to know that your goods were safe? And the answer is all 1,000. Websites, servers, and domain name systems, when not secure, is like leaving shop fronts wide open. That enables very easy passage for cyber criminals to gain access. And the bit that many people don't understand is that a website, typically a company will have hundreds, if not thousands, a website can give you access to email systems, the network, and the infrastructure, all the way up to, as we say, command and control, which is what happened at SolarWinds in 2020. It actually happened in 2019. It went for about 18 months before it was discovered.
Okay.
So that's a really important point, Gregory.
Which takes us to, I want to start out with two slides you've given us that, and I'm looking at them now on my desk. Our audience is looking at them on the screen. One of them is, two of them actually, they're saying your connection is not private, and there's another one which is an Israeli website, a Microsoft, I believe, also not secure. And in the left-hand corner, it says not secure, which is obviously your system. Without giving away your family secrets, can you just give me a little idea, the audience, a little idea of what your methodology is and how you arrive at these?
Yeah. That stuff you've got there, those two slides, they're available to anyone. Okay. So if you look at, and if we look at Microsoft, for example, in 2020, we had a client that suffered a number of incidents, let's call them. And they asked us to, within Israel, and they asked us to look at Microsoft, which is the main third-party supplier for their emails and for their DNS, etc. What we found was a plethora of Microsoft not secure websites. And what does that mean?
You mean across Israel?
Yes, absolutely. Okay. So the slides that you've got there, the first one that says your connection is not private, that's the same domain, the Microsoft domain. And what that means is that the security digital certificate or the configuration is there's an error. And it could be a whole plethora of reasons. The one that's resolved, the picture you've got with the actual Microsoft.il Israel website shown as not secure, that's like a major, it should be sounding klaxons out to anyone that goes on it. You should actually avoid. In Australia, they did a test whereby, and this is in the URL address bar at the top, in the top left-hand corner. Australia did a research paper on, I think it was 10,000 people, and over 90% of people still clicked on a not secure website, which is just an incredible thing. So Google right at this moment are looking at ways to enhance the information that they share with a website visitor of its security posture. That's a really important thing, because it's important to understand that the websites and the internet have been weaponized for many years. Criminals use the internet the same as you and I, but they've used it for a different purpose. They use it to find exposed and exploitable positions. You and I want to buy a pair of jeans or to book a ticket to the opera or something. It's a very different reason. But here's the bit that most people don't understand. In the world today, there's about 2 billion websites. The majority are active. Over 30,000 websites every single day are hacked.
Wow.
That's a big number. So if you then stop and think about this in simple terms, like, excuse me, I always try and make this simple. If you imagine a whole room full, a large industrial building full of hackers, which is what it's like in some parts of the world, what they're looking for is easily exploitable, exposed websites. So, for example, if the AAA, let's keep that thought, if the AAA were hacked, it was from several thousand miles away. It wasn't someone walking into their office and doing something.
Okay.
They got access through exposed internet connectivity.
And going back just a bit, so, and the systems and the methodology that you and your crew use, is this just systems that you've developed yourself? I mean, I can't do it myself because I'm assuming I don't have the wherewithal or the technology.
Not quite true. I could teach you in a reasonable time to be pretty good, but you'll be, a big fan of Steve King as I am.
Yeah, okay.
He cites me as the global expert in this market, so I'm flattered. But the long and short
coming
is,
from Steve King, who actually is going to be a subsequent interview.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm flattered. But the point is, this is called OSINT technology, okay? And you'll know that open source intelligence has been around since the 1930s. It's evolved from analog into digital, and what OSINT technology, and this is why we can do what we do, we never go beyond a firewall, because that's actually then abusing the Computer Misuse Act.
Right, okay.
And illegal. Cyber criminals will do that. So what we do is we will show the vulnerabilities and exposure. That's where it stops. A company can either decide, or a government, or a military, or an intelligence agency for that matter, they can decide whether to act upon it or ignore it. By ignoring it, the vulnerability remains. And what we've got here is a mass exploitation of exposed positions.
And what's interesting is the point you made about people don't realize how old open source intelligence is, and it really only got into the headlines after 9/11.
Yeah.
And the congressional hearings that were held in 2002, you had I don't know how many witnesses telling the congressman, how this stuff worked, and they're like going, wow, really? This is out there? So, and now it's obviously built, and obviously I would say almost no decent coverage of the Ukraine war or even the current war in Israel could be done without access to these sources.
Absolutely.
And it's more than just opening up your social media feed. It's the New York Times, CNN, Google. They're all opening and have opened their own open source intelligence units.
This is true, Gregory, but there's a really distinct difference here, and this is why, again, with Steve King's comment, if we look at Microsoft, as I'm not picking on Microsoft. But I did tell
everybody does, so feel free. But
but I did tell Brad Smith of their issues just a few weeks ago, personally, in person in London. Microsoft have 8,500 staff in their security team, experts, 8,500 staff. Most companies don't have 8,500 staff. They can't do, or they've not managed to do, or they're ignoring what we do, and the vulnerabilities are still there because of it. So going back to the program we did in 2020 to 2021 on Microsoft's Israel footprint, it took us over 6 months for them to finally listen, to shut down the websites that were exposed and said, please don't tell anyone. What had happened, the really key thing there is that first slide, and I hope that Olivier will be able to share that, is you'll see it says at the bottom of it that I've highlighted, this security certificate expired 554 days ago. So in other words, that website had been insecure for at least 1.5 years before we found it. By being insecure is exploitable.
Which is interesting, which takes me to the next question, which we talked about, that last Friday night, the night before the Hamas attack on the border, etc., and we were talking about this, there was a massive cyber attack at many points in Israel's cyber system. But most especially, they attacked Noga, which is, as I understand it, Israel's largest internet service provider. So obviously there, the thing was, let's let's get these servers offline, let's kill the internet, let's kill the communications because it will help us in the attack tomorrow. Can you just, and we have a slide coming up now, I think Olivier's put up from you, which shows that the site was insecure. Can you just walk us through that?
Yeah, it's a little bit more than just the site. It's the DNS. So
I'm sorry.
That's fine. But the DNS is a really critical thing for people to understand. And although someone that's become a reasonable friend of mine, Dr. Paul Mockapetris, invented DNS back in 1983 to 1986, one of the first ever internet protocols, and they were waiting for the Internet Engineering Task Force to issue an RFC, which is a request for control. So although it's been around since 86, it's still very, very much misunderstood. And DNS, for simplicity's sake, is you'll sit at your PC or your computer or your phone, but what DNS allows you to do is connect through a series of servers that will take the command, the web link, the text that we work in, to a series of 4 numbers punctuated by dots. That is the international global connectivity of DNS. Nothing happens without DNS, nothing good, nothing bad. So what we've got is adversaries are now allowed and enabled, since Edward Snowden gave revelations in 2012, 2013, of intelligence agencies exploiting DNS, that you'll see from the last decade, the amount of cybercrimes gone through the roof. And it's because of those revelations.
Exactly. I mean, we probably need a separate show just to talk about Ed Snowden, which kind of takes me to the next question. Again, we talked about this in the last couple of days. So what Hamas has done, or its agents have done, is they basically have created this hybrid attack, an attack of both cyber and kinetic. And what we're talking about is basically the Russian playbook in Ukraine. There's commonalities throughout, yes?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Look, it's actually here. This book I wrote, I was commissioned to write on the Ukraine cyber wars. And what happened, Gregory, excuse me while I prop up my laptop again. What happened, Gregory, is in January 2022, Russia launched cyber attacks against 70 Ukraine websites, and mainly government and critical infrastructure. And because, you've been privy to a lot of the information that I've shared with you in the last few days, because the Ukraine government websites were as insecure, systemically insecure, as the Israeli websites, and including, I think I sent you a screenshot last night was bloody train delays. I've sent you a screenshot of the cybersecurity center for Ukraine, and it was actually also maintaining a not secure website on the 18th of January 2022.
We have that. We have that slide. And we'll put it up for the viewers now. Yeah.
They suffered they were one of the 70 plus organizations that suffered a cyber attack. What those cyber attacks do, and what Noga, the ISP in Israel, suffered, were these cyber attacks both at their websites, their servers, which is really key, and their DNS. So all comms were down. It's like cutting the head off a snake and thinking the snake will live. It doesn't happen.
No, it was, and if you read the reports last night and this morning, that exact same scenario started again last night. Israel said they have never been hit with so many simultaneous attacks from so many sources as last night and this morning. So what you're talking about is and that's here's a case where the headline is true. The only difference, Gregory, look, it's really important because we studied, obviously to write a book, but we studied intensely the Ukraine cyber war. And you can go back to 2016, in actual fact, if you want to see where Russia had learnt from their masters, if you will, the Americans, in the Edward Snowden revelations. Russia was doing a lot of attacks, preemptive attacks and cyber attacks against Ukraine, and started to do the OMP, the Office of Personnel Management, the OPM, where they took
22 million security cleared American citizens' details under the noses of the OPM. They were testing and pushing how far they could go from 2013 to perfecting their tradecraft that they learnt from the intelligence agencies of the US and the Five Eyes, and they were starting to exploit them 180 degrees against the surveillance capability that the intelligence agencies wanted to use it for, and indeed do.
Excellent point, because, and we talked about this actually way before the Ukraine war, where we had realized that Russian capabilities, in a way, maybe not in a way, are so much superior to anything the West has been able to throw out there, because the Russians learned a long time ago that it's a lot cheaper to get really, really good at cyber attacks, because it's a lot cheaper than having to build tanks. And those attacks, and we talked about the fact that in the last 4 or 5 years, these quote-unquote unrelated attacks, an electric grid over here, a nursing home over here, a medical provider over here in the United States, were actually all related, simply testing. And I think, as you talked about it before, SolarWinds is not over. Every day they seem to find another, for lack of a better phrase, a Russian mole, something that's been embedded in their system. So it's continual. Anyway, I want to get back on track. We also talked about last night that there's a bigger issue here, and that's about backing up data, fortifying your internet, etc. Part of my audience is legal technology whiz kids, IT people, just corporate people that are interested. Can you just run me by that whole process?
Sure. Look, let's stay with SolarWinds, because that's a great example, and it'll give an example of that and explain. What SolarWinds did after our paper and our reaching out to SolarWinds started addressing their exposed DNS. And just to reiterate, SolarWinds suffered a cyber attack on a not secure subdomain, so one of their websites that was not secure in the top left-hand corner, and also suffered a DNS attack because their DNS servers weren't secure. So the combination of the two allowed the Russian attackers over an 18-month period to laterally move around inside the infrastructure and network and take over command control. The reason the 18,000 consequential cyber attacks occurred against the US Treasury and US government was because readily digital trust was made between SolarWinds and the US Treasury, for example. So when they got information and digital updates post the cyber attack, they readily accepted them. They didn't know they carried malware, which is the malware was called Sunburst, which one title of my book.
Another book, yep.
So the modus operandi from Stuxnet all the way back in 2008 is exactly the same today. The playbook is identical. The only difference is it's our adversaries using it against us. And here's the biggest challenge. SolarWinds, like virtually every other company, they may understand a little bit about DNS. It's a very complex area. I'm trying to make it sound simple, but it's very complex. But they may look at their top level domain. And again, I could send you more information about this because I've written a bloody book on the thing. SolarWinds, on the day and a year before their attack, had very insecure DNS, which you've got some pictures of other companies. After 6 months after the event, and they were learning from what I was sharing with them, they addressed their top level domain. What they failed to do is to address the other domains, so it was a waste of time. So this is why SolarWinds is still totally exposed today, and people can, what we call, live off the land and just almost BCC themselves in to all communications in and out of those servers. So it's like having someone standing over your shoulder for every single piece of communication and enabling them to alter it. In the Ukraine war, Gregory, I explained this, a very simple thing. I've got example after example, but let's say the commander of the military forces in Ukraine sends an email to his frontline team at Kiev and says, take your position and move it 100 miles east to defend that region. and somebody's got control of that server, and they go, just change one word from east to west.
Yeah, okay.
Send those guys into a surefire hell where they're all going to be annihilated. That ability is there.
And it's interesting because that's exactly what the Ukrainians have done to Russian forces.
Sure.
I haven't seen too many reports of the Russians doing it to Ukrainians, but maybe that's because it's buried. But we have seen reports in which the Ukrainians have been able to get into those servers and do exactly what you talk about.
Here's an example. I've got to tell you this example. It's not in our script, I know, but I'm going off piece.
Go ahead.
In November 2021, the FBI sent 100,000 emails complete with malware to unsuspecting recipients. Okay? November 2021. The FBI did not send them. And they didn't send 100,000 emails with malicious malware. The data and the email addresses were contained within the server. A nefarious actor gained access to the insecure server and doctored the emails and sent them out. That's called a DNS tampering and abuse attack. And it's only after the event, you can imagine the chaos that caused. And in 2019, CISA, the Cyber Infrastructure Security Agency, issued their first ever emergency directive, M-19-01, on DNS tampering after not all, but the vast majority of federal agencies suffered DNS attacks.
Okay, we can talk. We should go down that road too. I want to go back because you mentioned something very interesting with SolarWinds, and that's about supply chains. Mm-hmm. And that issue is extremely important in Israel because the Israeli command structure, its supply structure, is quite dependent on a string of companies down the line. What we're going to do right now is for our viewers is we're going to show them 3 graphics which you sent, which shows the insecurity of those suppliers. And can you just walk us through that?
Sure. Look, the supply chain is a very complex thing. In America, we'll get into Israel, but in America, Katie Arrington, who was the CISO for the Department of Defense, has been the mother of CMMC, which is the cybersecurity maturity model. And that enforces, or should enforce, when it finally becomes legislation, supply chains to provide security and be able to evidence it. Israel is no different. Every country in the world is the same. Companies have thousands of suppliers, and the bigger they are, the more they have. What we uncovered last weekend, within hours of this attack, was the fact that the Israeli military not only themselves have insecure positions of their internet assets, but so do their supply chain. And when I say insecure, I'm talking about not only basic, not secure websites, and we're talking homepages here. We're not talking about some spurious 10-year-old subdomain that someone's forgotten about that's connected to the top-level domain, so it's a back door. We're talking about top-level domains here. So this is basic 101 security failure.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at the slides
now. You're
looking
at them. You've got them.
Yeah.
So what we've got here is there's 2 main points here, and although obviously I'm very happy to be breathing and share this information with you, there'll be a lot of people upset with the fact that I'm sharing this with you and your readers and viewers. What we've got here are 2 main issues. One, the company themselves aren't maintaining or controlling basic security. And that sort of flies in the face of the Israeli military stance on being one of the world's leading experts. That's the first thing. 2, it flies in the face of all procurement capability of the Israeli military to make sure their supply chain is indeed not adding to their insecurity, but making them more secure. So you've got this almost colander effect with holes everywhere, with leaks everywhere, that are coming up to the Israeli military, and the Israeli military aren't even aware of it.
No, which is why we talked about again why SolarWinds was so important, because that whole system is why all these companies got sunk.
Dominoes.
It's just, anyway, it's yeah. But it's, as you said before, it is amazing to me that the Israelis, who have, seem to vaunt the fact that they have the best security system as far as along the Gaza wall, we have the best cybersecurity system and defenses, blah, 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 are so open to attack. I mean, there is if you've followed any of the Israeli commentators on, for instance, Facebook and Twitter, I still call it Twitter, not X.
Yeah.
There have been some unbelievable threads explaining how in the last 5 or 6 years, due to corruption, just simply not paying attention, etc., that the Israeli military capacity, the Israeli cyber capacity has just gone downhill. So it is now, in this particular war, it is shocking to see not only how indefensible Israel was to allow these attackers to come in, but also how pathetic their cybersecurity systems were when you thought it would be, as you said before, the best in the world.
Gregory, there's a reason for that. It's really important for me to explain that. If we stay with, and say, look, through the 80s and 90s, the internet and private computing, public computing was in its infancy. If we then go to 2001 and the Twin Towers atrocities, under the Bush administration, Congress signed off billions, tens, if not hundreds of billions for America and their allies, which includes Israel, to actually spend on digital supremacy. And by digital supremacy, they focused 100% on surveillance and offense. Okay, so they were just looking at how they could get into people's systems, phones, PCs, laptops, whatever. We know that we're in a surveillance state, no matter where you are. And what they wanted to then also manage to do is to take over command control. It's where remote access came from. The NSA developed remote access, okay, so they can take over control. And it was originally sold and is sold for an engineer not to have to visit your office. They can do it remotely. But that remote access actually also enabled surveillance. So that's 2001 under Bush and then Obama. And Israel were no different. So Israel and America and our own GCHQ were colluding and working collectively to make themselves superior in the digital surveillance space and offense. And they got called out a few times, as we know. But then if we then say, look, one of the biggest areas of this is internet assets, which is websites, servers, and DNS, domain name systems. What the academia were taught and teaching as part of their curriculum was endpoint protection, phishing attacks, malware protection, all of these things. There are literally, here we are 20 odd years later, there is not one academic university that I know of that teaches DNS and internet assets. And the reason for that is they were told not to. They were actively told, do not address these issues. And I speak to people all the time. I was at a function last night on AI, 300 people, and they're going, oh, AI is everything. And here's the leader. And I've gone, but they're not secure. They're totally not secure.
And I want to go down that path because we talked about this before, that the DNA servers are invariably outsourced to a very small handful of organizations.
Yeah.
And that is where the problems lie.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that you've cataloged tons of stuff with respect to Microsoft. But let's pinpoint that. The biggest danger in the outsourcing of these servers, the fact that companies don't own and control them, what's the biggest danger to you?
Well, look, you've got a problem that we use a term that the tail is wagging the dog. And if you look at the US military and UK military, US government, UK government, and indeed the Israeli government and military, they're all outsourcing to Microsoft in the main. Okay, so when I gave my latest book to Brad Smith in London at a Tech UK event, and I took him aside and whispered quietly in his ear because I didn't want everyone to hear. Mr. Smith, we're the people that identified the Israeli website exposures in 2020. He may or may not know. But also, I want to tell you off the record that there's 22.6 million insecure Microsoft servers around the world. And he said, I'll get someone to look at it. I've never heard back. That was 3 months ago.
And you won't, no.
And here's the point, one could say, and people do say to me, oh, just tell us which ones aren't secure. Like, you've got pictures. Oh, which ones aren't secure? You wouldn't ask, but maybe the US military might, or Mossad might, or someone might. The fact is they are backdoors and they can be accessed and breached. With the Microsoft example in 2020, it took us over 6 months to at least get them to acknowledge the problem. It takes less than 6 minutes for a cyber gang to infiltrate them. You can see where the problem lies. Forget bureaucracy. We've got egos and we've got appendage swinging of people that think they know best. You imagine some of those things I've sent you and you've got in front of you, which are factual. They are real time.
No, I'm looking at them.
If I was to phone one of their CEO today and say, this is a problem, they'd most probably not want to talk to me.
Well, no, I'm looking at the slide, which our viewers will see shortly, the one effect of how insecure Mossad is.
Yeah.
That's, to me, in a way, it boggles my mind. But this again goes to the fact of what you said before, that there's been so much time, energy, and money devoted to offense, devoted to we're going to get those guys, devoted to surveillance, that no one said, well, how are we protecting ourselves?
The only man to ever say something about that, and I'm not a huge fan, but he ran 2-3 letter agencies for a number of years, and Stuxnet was under his watch. But General Michael Hayden turned around in a later interview in 2010 after Stuxnet, and he said 2 things. When he was asked, did the United States launch Stuxnet? And he said, I don't know, and if I did, I couldn't talk about it. Okay, the first thing he said. The second thing he said, which is possibly more pertinent to this conversation, is he said, no one thought to consider what backdoors might mean if our adversaries got hold of them. And that's what we're living. So my 4th book, I know we'll touch on it, is called Surveillance - The Blueprint for Cybercrime. And that's exactly what it is. So you've got the intelligence agencies playing digital whack-a-mole, to be honest with you. And what you may or may not know is about 80% of all cyber attacks in the world are against America.
What percentage?
80%.
Oh, wow.
And the reason for that, Gregory, is not just because everyone hates America. That's not the case at all. But the reason for that is America is so dependent on digital capability, and they've ignored defense because the hierarchy never told them to think about it. They don't teach it in their universities.
No, and the problem we talked about before is the fact that they've only the thrust has been the commercial enterprise, the commercial benefit, and no one's ever said, oh, this is going to save you money. This is, well, you know what? There's a whole other side, and now you're suffering from it because you didn't think about it. Yeah. But anyway, 2 other points I want to make. We talked about, and I want to quote from your book about what you call keyboard warriors, and the fact that they have basically a run of the gift shop because we haven't managed security anywhere near the way we should. Keyboard warriors are both a guy sitting alone at home, but also these factories, as we talked about, of 2,000 guys sitting out in Kazakhstan and just doing their worst. Can you just talk about a little bit about the keyboard warriors?
Sure. Look, the term came from a dear friend of mine that works with me, based out of the United States, was one of the world's first ever cyber warriors. Okay, and he's an incredible guy, 45 years experience. But what they were doing was protecting their own, and this was just after the Cold War and in the infancy of the internet. So that evolution of the APRANET into the internet and to then, mainstream that we all are literally totally dependent on it. We couldn't have this conversation without the internet. It's as simple as that. So that was what the cyber warriors started as. Keyboard warriors, which is the evolution, are the people that with more nefarious intent. So the modus operandi is identical. So if you've got, for example, a 3-letter agency that says we want to monitor China, they will look for exposed websites, they will look for exposed and insecure servers, and they will look for the DNS. There's exactly the same. This isn't like the old days of VHS and Betamax videos. There is only one version. You can only do it one way. And that's through websites, servers, and domain name systems. And then you add another complexity, which is content distribution network. Think of it as DHL, FedEx for digital packets.
And it's getting easier because basically, as you and I both know, we each of us has access the dark web. Yep. And you need the software to do that. I got it for you at pretty good trip. They don't accept credit cards. They don't accept credit cards, but you can get the stuff.
You can dance with the devil if you want. Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay, 2 more points so we can close this out, and we need to talk about it. And I wrote about it in a blog post earlier this week. Russia just blew a hole in the pipeline between Finland and Estonia. We know it's the Russians. Not a doubt in our mind. I've talked to a ton of military intel people the last 2 days. It's not going to be, they're never going to be acknowledged for a lot of political reasons. But one point not being discussed a lot is the cyber attacks Russia is executing upon Finland. Can you just talk about that for a bit?
Yeah, we got an alert on Thursday evening about the main Finnish central bank, Finnish government, and other financial institutions suffering cyber attacks. And predominantly these are what are known as DDoS attacks, which is distributed denial of service. So the whole system is taken over, and that relies on DNS servers. Okay, so they're getting millions of requests per second, and they just go, "Oh, we can't keep up." So they literally shut down. It's a little bit like a person can't survive without water for 72 hours. Well, servers can't contain that much requests and do their job. It's too confusing for them. So DDoS attacks have become very, very popular. What we did, and I've shared some with you, is the DNS positions of some of the Finnish government entities. So if you take the Ukraine or Finnish or Israeli, anywhere that attacks are taking place, the one thing they'll go for, and it doesn't matter whether it's Russia, China, Iran, Korea, it doesn't particularly matter. It could be the kid next door for all it matters. You don't need to be sophisticated and have a team of 2,000 people in an industrial center to launch these attacks. You can use computers to do that. AI is a very dangerous position for us to be hurtling towards to enable that automation of attack. That's another, we'll discuss that another time. Mm-hmm. But if you look at what's going on in Finland, it's not that different to what happened in Rogers Communications in 2022 in Canada. Oh,
that's right. Yeah, we talked about this.
We talked about that.
Yeah, talk about that.
What happened? What I didn't mention when we did talk about that is Putin was interviewed on the Saturday after that attack. And what happened in Rogers Communications, it wasn't their first attack. And the reason it's not their first is because the adversaries are seeing how far they can get, how easy they can attack. But in 2022, literally, it may have been as simple as someone just saying, attack Rogers Communications, and within minutes the attack was live. What actually happened was Gazprom were demanding back a repaired turbine that Canada, one of the companies in Canada, had repaired. And the Canadian company had gone to the Parliament and the government in Canada and said, if we return this, we're going to actually breach the sanctions against Russia by providing the turbine, returning it.
The Ukraine-related sanctions, yeah.
Absolutely. So what there was this debacle, and it was public, about whether they should or shouldn't. And what Putin, it was interviewed 2 days after the Rogers attack, which took out 40% of the entire communications of Canada. He turned around and said, I don't need to use a tank. I can just destabilize the infrastructure. He was telling us exactly what he'd done.
No, it's the fact is it's just arrogant in your face, and he realizes, what are you going to do about it?
Yeah,
and that's what's amazing to me. And that's
so what we've got, Gregory, in truth, is look, the reason why Australia, America, Five Eyes in the main, and the Allies predominantly, and now Israel, unfortunately. And of course, the Gaza Strip are suffering repercussions, but they've literally got no water, no food, and no electricity, so they haven't got any internet. So game over, really, for those people, which is very, very sad for the implications and repercussions. But what we've got is all of the allies, including Israel, are suffering these cyber attacks easily because they lack defense. They lack basic 101 security. And my goodness, I had a debate with the Bank of America, and I make no bones about it. I'll only talk about stuff that's not under NDA openly. And the Bank of America spend, and rejoiced, announcing they spend $1 billion a year on cybersecurity. When I spoke to the chap and said, you've got some serious problems, he wanted to stab me in the back. Okay, literally. And I said, well, look, I'm just the messenger, but I think you need to know, because this isn't just about your ego or your appendage swinging or the 4 letters after your name. This is a case of real life exposure. So eventually, after locking horns for a while, and we're the good guys, I don't know why we're locking horns, but after a while, we showed him that, I won't quote the URL, and it actually got taken offline the same day, but the high net worth login for Bank of America was not secure. It was actually displaying and not secure. And for the more technical watchers of this video, what had happened is the certificate, the digital certificate, was valid. It was perfect. It was an EV certificate, extended validation. It was perfect. What they weren't doing is sending HTTP requests and redirecting them to HTTPS.
Explain
so that became the standard in 2018.
Right.
So the website might have been exposed for 5 years. I don't know. But the reality is, if I was a high net worth client at Bank of America, I'd have been pretty peeved about it. And if I'd suffered a cyber attack with my PII data, my personal identifying information, having been breached, I'd be looking for Bank of America to cover me.
No, and I should add to the audience that Andy sends me these things, obviously heavily redacted, just to give me an idea of what's happening out there in the real world. So whenever I read about, oh my God, did you see who got attacked? I'm going, that's nothing. Yeah. I'd love to tell you about who got attacked, but I can't. Anyway, I want to wrap this up with something that has been, I would say, at the top of both of our minds, and it's going to be the subject of one of my, as I think as somebody told me, my too long didn't read essays coming up. And that's about what we both have termed this, I can't remember because you said it so well, but it's basically the paper you just published this week, which we will link in the threads to the YouTube that most people are watching this on, and the related blog post. And that's about how we've reached this brutal hybrid war of this amazing merger of both a cyber war and a kinetic war. Yeah. And I want to just wrap this up and let you have the last word on that.
Sure. Look, cyber war has been going on for a couple of decades, behind the scenes. The Ukraine cyber war that commenced in January 2022 preceded the kinetic invasion on the 24th of February 2022. I know it because it's my sister's birthday. Equally, I know the Electoral Commission announced their, and it's nothing to do with me, it's just coincidence, my father's birthday is on the 8th of August, so the Electoral Commission in the UK announced the cyber attack that happened a year before on his birthday. So these things, they're not coincidental in many ways. But the Ukraine attacks, cyber attacks by Russia in January leading up to the invasion on the 24th of February 2022 was around 3.5 weeks, from the cyber war to the kinetic. What we've seen in last weekend at around 1800 hours local time, Noga, the internet service provider, started suffering cyber attacks. Within hours, bombs were being dropped. So what we've seen now is what we're terming a hybrid warfare, whereby you've got not only the use of cyber espionage and attacks to destabilize, cause chaos, break down communications, they are swiftly followed almost simultaneously with kinetic warfare. So the two can almost be considered as inseparable, and modern warfare it includes cyber as a precursor, 100%. It's just the timing has been greatly reduced from 3 weeks to almost 3 hours. I don't know exactly.
Almost instantaneously. I mean, what I've been fascinated by, as you well know, we're doing this interview after I've just been up for 6 or 7 hours, hence I didn't shave, boys and girls.
Me too.
Talking to military intel guys who have told me that the combination of traditional war tactics being merged with what they call, or what you've called, cutting-edge cybersecurity tactics has been incredible. And the war that's currently been undergoing now for the last week in Israel is going to generate some enormous military strategy analysis papers. And when you were talking about this at the beginning, that there hasn't been proper education at the university level or collegiate level, there hasn't even been proper education at the military colleges. When I've attended conferences at the U.S. War College in Pennsylvania and the equivalent Naval War College in Maryland, everybody there tells me that they have cut down so much on normal IT/cyber courses, and they just talk about, traditional kinetic warfare, that now is reversed. Yesterday, a friend of mine who teaches at the Naval Academy said, it's a whole new world. And I felt like saying, well, not so new. You guys are just getting into it now. And all of a sudden now the military, in the U.S. at least, the military colleges are expanding their coursework. They're bringing in cyber experts such as yourself. So to me, it's I don't want to use the word fascinating. Fascinating is when my wife makes a really cool spaghetti. This is just crazy.
Let me finish with one story on that, Gregory. Because
one more story. Okay.
It'll tell you of the errors at military level and government. As you've got the hard copies that I've shared with you, in 2022, I had the good fortune to sit down with the Air Commodore of the UK Academy for the Ministry of Defence. Okay, he's now retired. I won't name him for fear of embarrassment. And he was on Sky News telling about the Ministry of Defence cyber attack that happened earlier that year before he retired, and the implications and the resolution. And they couldn't identify it as Russia, China. They couldn't identify it. But what they did in a nutshell was they ripped out all the hardware, all the software, renewed everything, spent tens of millions, and thought that was okay. So we had a conversation for about an hour and a half. And then I met him in London for 3 hours. And I said to him, look, I'm not a military strategist. You are. But let me ask you a question. At the Ministry of Defence Academy, what does it look like? He said, okay, well, we've got a 10-foot high ring-fenced perimeter. There's only one access. You're coming in or out, and it's through armed guards. If you've not got an invite, you're not coming in. And if you haven't got a pass, you're not getting out. So I said, okay, great. tell me about the renewal of all the hardware and software. He said, oh, okay, yeah, we changed all the PCs, all the laptops, all the phones. We changed everything. We renewed the software. We changed password. We did all these things. I said, great. What did you then do? He said, we then plugged it all in and got on to work. I said, right, there was your mistake. Who checked the DNS servers? He said, what? I said, who checked the DNS servers? And he said, I don't even know what they are.
I was just going to say that. Well, we've had this conversation. Actually, we've had this conversation with people before in the room, and you get this fog comes over people. Yeah.
So what I proved to him, and I gave a report to him, I'll share it with you if you want. It showed that the third-party suppliers, no different to the stuff I've shared with you on Israel, had not done their job very well, and that all of the servers that they were supplying that were connecting the Ministry of Defense, don't forget we were under COVID-19 as well at the time, so everyone was being taught online. All we were doing was teaching our enemies of what we're teaching our people. And that's exactly the same. So my reservation, and look, Steve King, who you've got a lot of time for, I've got an awful lot of time for, I share a lot more with him than I do with you. No disrespect, but I do.
Oh no, there's a reason for that too.
He despairs. He's in disbelief. We've just written a paper, and we're just about to publish it because we're so peeved at the J3 JFHQ guys in America. We wrote a paper on the 21st of September on the F-35, 3 days after it crashed and ejected a pilot. We've actually shown that the third-party supply chain and your manufacturers are all totally insecure and exposed. And this will give you reason and rationale how the Chinese have got a blueprint and a replica plane without any R&D, and they're knocking them out, the same as they are submarines, as if they're going out of fashion. We are our own worst enemy.
I was just going to say that I had an almost identical conversation with a friend of mine who said, how in hell are the Chinese doing this? They said it's almost like a mirror image of what we have. And I
Exactly.
I says, I have to put you in touch with Andy, and he'll explain.
It's exactly what's happening.
Yeah.
In America last year, it's estimated $600 billion was lost in IP theft.
Was lost in
IP theft, intellectual property.
Okay.
So blueprints. So look, as I say to you, if I won't name a company, it'd be very easy to. If a company that are manufacturing, say, F-35s or Trident submarines or anything else, if their website isn't secure, it means, unfortunately, in yesteryear of warfare, they had to wear a uniform. You knew who the enemy was. Now, there's very little attribution because they use a Tor system, the onion ring system, and it goes from place to place to place. So you've got a job to find out exactly where it came from. 2, they don't wear uniforms. 3, they are silent killers. If you go back to the film where the new Q says to James Bond, I can do more damage on my laptop drinking my Earl Grey tea in the morning than you can ever in the field. The keyboard is not only mightier than the sword, it's mightier than a compromised F-35.
Yep. No.
That's the truth.
Anyway.
So we're here to help. Gregory, we're not here to shoot people. We're here to help.
No. I know that. And to the audience, I can say that at the end of this interview, there'll be a title card popping up, which will have all of Andy's contact information, and it will also be repeated in the thread. And I will also link to a great essay that Andy put out this week, on hybrid war, which you'll be able to read. And all of it will be linked again in the cover blog post, which many of you read. So again, Andy, I appreciate your time. This has been a hoot in a way. Let me leave it here. My biggest fear from everything we talked about is that you and I are going to be having another video interview probably in the very near future, and another interview after that. So it's just an unending series of crises. Every day, like you, my mind explodes. So I know you're swamped, I'm swamped, but again, I'm just sitting here writing about it, interviewing people about it, and talking about it, and you're actually doing it. So I really sincerely appreciate you carving out the time.
It's my pleasure, Gregory. Always a pleasure. We've got to address the issues.
All right. Thanks a lot.
My pleasure.